Elias was a man who saw potential where others saw only rust and ruin. A master mechanic by trade and a historian by passion, he spent his days in a sprawling, converted barn that smelled permanently of diesel, metallic dust, and old grease. His business was simple. He hunted down mechanical relics, engines, transmissions, and chassis from the golden age of automotive engineering, and either restored them to their former glory or stripped them for parts to keep other legends on the road. His latest acquisition, however, was a gamble even for him. It was a monstrous V12 engine, a relic from the late 1930s, which he had won at a blind police auction for the price of scrap metal. The listing had described it simply as industrial machinery, seized evidence, case closed 1948. It was a lump of iron that had sat in a damp evidence locker for nearly 80 years before finally being purged from the system. Elias bought it for the sheer density of the high-quality cast iron, figuring that even if the internals were fused solid, the raw material would cover his costs. He used a heavy-duty gantry crane to lower the massive block onto his primary workbench. The suspension on his truck had groaned under the weight during the transport, a testament to the sheer mass of the object. It was heavily corroded, covered in a thick, flaking layer of orange rust and solidified black sludge that hid most of its original features. As the chains rattled loose, Elias wiped a gloved hand across the valve cover. The metal was cold and unforgiving. Most mechanics would have looked at the seized pistons and the cracked exhaust headers and sent it straight to the smelter, but Elias felt a strange gravity to the piece. The casting marks were obscured, but the architecture of the engine suggested it was something bespoke, perhaps a prototype intended for a high-performance touring car or a racing boat that never saw the water. The mystery of its origin was the hook, but the work was the reality. He grabbed his pneumatic impact wrench and a wire brush, preparing for the dirty work of dismantling the beast. Before we dig deeper into this mystery, we have a quick request for you guys. We are incredibly close to hitting our goal of 10,000 subscribers, and we need your help to cross that finish line. If you love stories of hidden treasures and mechanical mysteries, please hit that subscribe button right now. It makes a massive difference for the channel. Also, if you want to support our storytelling directly, check out the super thanks button below. It helps us keep the lights on and the stories coming. And one more thing, we want to know where our community is. Drop a comment below and tell us which country or city you are watching this video from. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to the workshop and see what Elias is about to find. The first step was removing the external ancillaries. The carburetor housings were fused shut, the aluminum oxidized into a white powder that crumbled at the touch. Elias worked methodically, the harsh whine of his angle grinder filling the barn as he cut through seized bolts that hadn't turned since before the Second World War. As he stripped away the layers of decay, he began to notice anomalies. The engine was heavy, far heavier than a standard V12 of this displacement should be. He had lifted similar engines before, usually weighing in around 800 pounds. This one strained his 2-ton hoist, suggesting a density that didn't make sense for a standard combustion engine. He initially attributed it to the accumulated grime or perhaps water trapped inside the water jackets, but the weight distribution felt off, centered low and deep within the block. He moved to the oil pan, a massive stamped steel reservoir at the bottom of the engine. Usually, this would be filled with sludge, the coagulated remains of ancient motor oil. He placed a large catch basin underneath and removed the drain plug. Nothing came out. Not a drop of oil, not even dust. Puzzled, he unbolted the rim of the pan, expecting it to fall loose. It didn't budge. He used a rubber mallet to hammer the sides, but the sound that returned wasn't the hollow clang of empty sheet metal. It was a dull, solid thud, like hitting a solid anvil. Elias frowned, adjusting his work light to get a better look. He took a scraper and aggressively cleaned the side of the oil pan, revealing a line of welding that was far too precise for a mass-produced engine. The oil pan hadn't just been bolted on, it had been welded shut from the inside before the engine was fully assembled. This was not a service modification, this was a permanent seal. Curiosity turned into suspicion. Elias realized this engine was never meant to be serviced. He grabbed an oxyacetylene torch, firing it up with a sharp hiss. The blue flame roared to life, and he directed the heat toward the strange weld line on the oil pan. The paint blistered and burned away, and the metal began to glow cherry red. He wasn't trying to melt it, just to weaken the seal enough to pry it open. After 20 minutes of intense heat and sweating under his welding mask, He killed the torch and jammed a heavy crowbar into the seam. With a grunt of exertion, he leveraged his entire body weight against the bar. The metal groaned, a screeching tear of steel, and the heavy pan finally peeled away from the block. It fell onto the concrete floor with a deafening crash that shook the tools on the walls. Elias stepped back, waving away the smoke, and looked down. The oil pan was not an oil pan at all. It was a false bottom. The actual crankcase of the engine was sealed off by a secondary plate of steel. But lying in the concave hollow of the false pan he had just removed was a layer of thick, greased canvas, wrapped tightly around rectangular bundles. The engine had been used as a shipping container, a Trojan horse made of iron. Elias knelt, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out with a trembling hand and sliced the twine binding the first canvas bundle. The fabric fell away, revealing not parts, but a stack of thick, creamy paper with intricate engravings. They were bearer bonds, financial instruments used decades ago, effectively as good as cash to whoever held them. He picked one up. It was issued by a defunct European railway conglomerate, dated 1938, with a face value of 10,000 francs. And there were hundreds of them. But that was just the beginning. Beneath the bonds, tucked into the corners of the false pan, were small, heavy pouches made of velvet. He lifted one, feeling the undeniable, shifting grit of stones inside. He poured the contents into his calloused palm. Under the harsh workshop light, a dozen rough, uncut diamonds tumbled out, catching the glare and refracting it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. Elias sat back on his heels, surrounded by the smell of burnt metal and the silence of the barn. He had bought scrap iron, but he had just broken into a vault that had been closed for nearly a century. Elias stood motionless over the workbench for a long time, the adrenaline humming in his ears like a high-voltage line. He carefully gathered the velvet pouches and the stacks of brittle paper, moving them to the only clean surface in the shop, his office desk. He locked the heavy steel door of the barn, sliding the deadbolt home with a clang that felt final. The isolation of his workshop, usually a source of comfort, now felt heavy with implication. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was the custodian of a fortune that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. He sat under the desk lamp, examining the bonds more closely. The paper was high-quality linen blend, resistant to the rot that had consumed the engine's exterior. The issuance date, 1938, placed them squarely in the frantic, fearful days before the continent erupted into war. These weren't just savings, this was flight capital. Wealth liquefied for a desperate escape or a criminal transfer. He returned to the engine block, viewing it now with a forensic eye. The false oil pan had been the easy hiding spot, the low-hanging fruit. If the builder had gone to the trouble of welding a false bottom, what else had they done to the core of the machine? The V12 sat there, a silent, rusty sphinx. Elias decided to attack the top end of the motor, the cylinder heads and the massive intake manifold that sat in the valley between the two banks of cylinders. In a functioning engine, the manifold was responsible for distributing air and fuel. It should be a hollow network of runners and plenums. But looking at the casting now, Elias noticed the proportions were wrong. The manifold was bulbous, the neck too thick, and the mounting flanges were unnecessarily wide. He picked up a breaker bar and fitted a socket to the head bolts. They were rusted tight. He applied torque, his muscles straining, until the first bolt sheared off with a sharp snap. He didn't care about preserving the fasteners anymore. He moved down the line, snapping or cutting the bolts until the left cylinder head was free. He hooked the chain hoist to the head and pumped the hydraulic lever. The heavy iron casting lifted reluctantly, separating from the block with a tearing sound of old gaskets. Elias peered into the cylinder bores. What he saw confirmed his suspicion that this engine had never fired a single shot. The pistons were there, but they were crude, solid slugs of steel, welded to the cylinder walls at the bottom of their stroke to add weight and simulate the mass of a real engine. The connecting rods were missing entirely. The engine was a prop, a hollow shell designed to pass a cursory inspection by customs agents or police who looked only at the external shape and weight. This meant the entire internal volume of the engine block was potential storage space. However, the most curious anomaly was the intake manifold he had yet to remove. With the cylinder head off, he could see into the intake ports. They were blocked. The manifold wasn't feeding air into the engine because it was a solid unit. He unbolted the manifold from the remaining cylinder bank and lifted it onto the bench. It was incredibly heavy for aluminum, far denser than it should have been. He tapped it with a hammer, The ring was deadened, muted by something inside. Unlike the steel oil pan, this was cast aluminum, softer but trickier to work with without destroying whatever was inside. He clamped the manifold into a large vise. He took a caliper and measured the external dimensions, then did a quick calculation of the volume. Based on the weight, the density was all wrong. There was a cavity inside, but it was surrounded by thick walls. He grabbed a portable X-ray unit he sometimes used to check for stress fractures in vintage chassis rails. It was old tech, grainy and dangerous if mishandled, but it would give him eyes inside the metal. He set up the emitter on one side of the manifold and the film plate on the other, cranking the timer. He retreated behind a LED screen and waited for the buzz to stop. Developing the film in his small darkroom sink took 20 minutes of agonizing patience. When he finally held the dripping negative up to the light box, the secret revealed itself in ghostly white and gray. The intake manifold was not a manifold at all. It was a capsule. Suspended within the thick aluminum casting was a perfect cylindrical tube, seemingly floating in the center. The X-ray showed that the runners of the manifold were actually solid ribs supporting this central tube. The tube appeared to be sealed with threaded caps on both ends, and inside the tube, dark, dense shapes were visible, distinctly different from the loose tumble of diamonds in the oil pan. These shapes were uniform, rectangular, and stacked. Elias returned to the vise with a new plan. He couldn't just cut it open recklessly. He set up a horizontal milling machine, a precision tool that would allow him to shave away the aluminum layer by layer until he reached the inner capsule. The mill hummed to life, the carbide cutter spinning at 3,000 revolutions per minute. He engaged the feed, and silver flakes of aluminum began to fly like snow. He worked for hours, his focus absolute, shaving millimeters at a time. The heat from the friction made the oil on the workbench smoke, adding a haze to the room. Finally, the cutter note changed, a higher-pitched squeal indicating it had hit a harder material. Elias hit the kill switch. He brushed away the aluminum chips. Glinting underneath was the dull, reddish sheen of copper. The inner capsule was made of heavy-gauge copper, likely chosen for its resistance to corrosion and its ability to seal hermetically. He had exposed the side of the cylinder. Now he needed to breach it. He switched to a small, high-speed rotary tool with a diamond-cutting wheel. With the precision of a surgeon, he cut a rectangular window into the copper. A hiss of escaping gas startled him. The capsule had been pressurized with inert gas, likely nitrogen, to prevent decay. This was professional work, military-grade preservation. He widened the hole and shone a penlight inside. The cavity was packed tight. He used a pair of long tweezers to extract the first item. It wasn't money or gold. It was a small, leather-bound logbook, the leather dried and stiff but intact. Beneath it were several stacks of glass slides, photographic negatives, wrapped in wax paper. And at the very bottom, wrapped in oil-soaked velvet, was a heavy, intricate mechanism made of brass and steel, looking like part of a clock or a locking device. Elias opened the logbook first. The pages were filled with handwriting in fountain pen. The ink faded to a sepia tone but legible. The language was French, which Elias could read haltingly thanks to his grandmother. The first entry was dated June 14, 1940, the day Paris fell to the invaders. The writer, a man named Henri, described the frantic packing of the collection from a private vault in the manufacturing district. But as Elias flipped through the pages, the narrative shifted from a simple evacuation to something darker. Henri wasn't just saving his own property. He was intercepting a shipment intended for the occupying forces. The collection referred to assets seized from a rival syndicate, the notorious Corsican Brotherhood, a criminal organization that had operated in the shadows of the pre-war chaos. The entry for August 1940 detailed the construction of the Iron Tomb, the V12 engine. Henri had been a master caster in an industrial foundry. He had taken the illicit fortune, bearer bonds from the syndicate's racketeering, diamonds from their smuggling routes, and something else, something referred to as the key, and cast them inside a fake engine block intended for a powerboat that would smuggle refugees to England. But the boat never left. The engine was seized during a raid on the dockyard, not because the authorities found the treasure, but because the boat lacked proper registration. The engine sat in impound, mistook for a piece of rusted junk, while Henri was arrested and presumably killed, taking the secret of the Iron Tomb to his grave. Elias realized he was holding the evidence of a double cross that had happened 80 years ago. He looked at the glass slides. He held one up to the light. It showed a map, an intricate blueprint of a building with subterranean levels. The title block on the blueprint read Banque de l'Indochine, Paris, Vault 4. The mechanism he had found, the brass device, wasn't just a trinket. It was a chaotic tumbler, a specific part of a high-security vault lock that couldn't be picked, only assembled. Henri hadn't just stolen the criminals' money. He had stolen the physical means to access their central reserve. The bonds and diamonds were just the petty cash. The real prize, according to the logbook, was whatever was locked in Vault 4, accessible only with the device Elias now held in his greasy hand. The discovery was dizzying. The bonds were worth millions as collectibles or redeemable assets if the banks still existed. The diamonds were a fortune in raw stone. But the map and the key pointed to a location that might still contain a hoard of pre-war wealth, lost to time. However, the logbook ended on a chilling note. The final entry, scrawled in haste, mentioned that the wolf had found him. The wolf was the enforcer for the Corsican Brotherhood. Henri had hidden the engine just hours before he was taken. Elias put the book down. The silence of the barn was suddenly broken by the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway outside. It was late, past midnight. No customers came this late. He killed the main workshop lights, plunging the room into shadows, leaving only the small desk lamp burning. He moved to the window, peering through the grime. A black SUV was idling at the gate, its headlights cutting through the fog. The engine he had bought was supposed to be a closed case, a piece of forgotten evidence. But someone somewhere might have been watching the auction records, waiting for the iron tomb to resurface. Elias realized that the history he had unearthed wasn't dead. It was just dormant, and he had just rung the wake-up bell. Elias stood in the darkness of his workshop, his breath held tight in his chest, watching the scene unfold at the gate through the dusty panes of the window. The black SUV sat idling, the low rumble of its engine barely audible over the wind rattling the corrugated metal roof of the barn. Two figures emerged from the vehicle. They were not police. Their movements were too casual, too predatory. They wore dark, nondescript clothing, and one of them held a tablet, the screen's pale blue glow illuminating a hard, angular face. They checked the mailbox, then shone a powerful tactical flashlight up the long gravel driveway, the beam sweeping across the rusted hulks of old cars that lined the entrance like iron sentinels. The light lingered on the main door of the barn for a terrifying second before snapping back to the vehicle. Elias knew instantly that they were confirming the address. The auction records were public information for those who knew where to look, and the purchase of the industrial scrap had likely triggered a digital tripwire set decades ago by someone very patient. The men climbed back into the SUV, and the vehicle slowly reversed, turning around and disappearing into the night mist. They hadn't left because they were lost. They had left to prepare. Elias knew he had hours, perhaps only until dawn, before they returned with a truck or a crew to force entry. He moved away from the window, his mind shifting from shock to survival mode. He was a mechanic. He solved problems for a living, and this was just a complex breakdown requiring an immediate overhaul. He couldn't fight a criminal syndicate, but he could disappear. He turned on the red emergency lights of the shop, low visibility, enough to work by without casting a glare outside. His first priority was the iron tomb. He couldn't move the massive V12 engine alone quickly enough to flee, and leaving it exposed was a death sentence. He grabbed the overhead gantry crane and maneuvered it back over the workbench. He lowered the heavy cast-iron cylinder heads he had removed earlier, placing them back onto the block loosely. He then grabbed a heavy, greasy tarp, one he used for painting, and threw it over the engine. To camouflage it further, he dragged over a pile of worthless transmission casings and exhaust pipes, stacking them haphazardly around and on top of the V12, transforming the multi-million-dollar vault into just another heap of scrap metal in a cluttered shop. If they broke in, they would look for a distinct engine, not a buried pile of junk. Next, the real treasure. Elias took the canvas-wrapped bonds, the velvet bags of diamonds, the brass key mechanism, and Henry's journal. He went to the back of the shop where he kept his personal project, a 1968 muscle car, a primer gray beast that looked rough but ran like a watch. He popped the trunk. Inside the spare tire well, he had fabricated a false floor for his tools years ago, a habit born of paranoia that was now paying off. He lined the compartment with bubble wrap and carefully placed the artifacts inside. The diamonds and bonds were wealth, but the journal and the brass mechanism were the targets. He sensed that whoever was hunting for the engine didn't care about the money as much as they cared about what the engine meant. Before leaving, Elias sat in the driver's seat of the muscle car and turned on a small, encrypted laptop he used for sourcing black market parts. He needed to understand the scope of what he held. He carefully scanned one of the glass slides using a high-resolution handheld scanner. The image on his screen was a blueprint of the Banque de l'Indochine, specifically the subterranean levels. He cross-referenced the address from the journal. The building in Paris still existed. It was no longer a bank. It had been converted into a government archives building in the 1950s. However, looking at modern satellite imagery and architectural forms, Elias noticed a discrepancy. The government building used the upper floors and the first basement level. The blueprints on the glass slide showed a level -3, a deep storage vault designed for gold bullion reserves. According to post-war reconstruction records he dug up on a specialized history forum, the lowest levels of that sector had been flooded and sealed off with concrete following a bombing raid in 1944, deemed too unstable to excavate. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The vault wasn't empty. It hadn't been robbed. It had been buried. Henry's journal confirmed that he had the key to a vault that was physically inaccessible to anyone who didn't know the specific layout or possessed the mechanism to bypass the primary blast doors before they were sealed. The Wolf and the Corsican Brotherhood had been hunting for the engine not just to recover the stolen bonds inside it, but because the brass device, the chaotic tumbler, was the only way to open the master lock of level -3 without triggering the seismic collapse failsafes that were standard in pre-war French banking fortresses. The diamonds and bonds Elias found in the engine were merely Henry's severance pay. The real fortune, the king's ransom, was still rotting in a wet, dark hole beneath the streets of Paris, waiting for the key. Elias checked the time. 3 a.m. He had to go. He grabbed a burner phone from his desk drawer and packed a go-bag with clothes, cash, and his passport. He took one last look at his workshop, the sanctuary he had built over 20 years. He knew he might never see it again. He walked to the main power breaker and killed the electricity to the entire property. He manually rolled up the rear bay door, the one that led to a dirt logging road behind the property. He fired up the muscle car. The V8 roared to life, a deep, guttural sound that felt reassuringly powerful. He eased the car out into the cool night air, the tires crunching softly on the pine needles. As he navigated the back roads, putting miles between himself and the inevitable raid on his workshop, his mind raced. He couldn't go to the police. The auction had been the leak. He couldn't go to a bank. The assets were flagged. He needed a ghost. He drove toward the coast, heading for a shipping container yard in the city of Savannah, 4 hours away. He had an old contact there, a man named Silas, who specialized in logistical anomalies. Silas owed him a favor for fixing a fleet of smuggling trucks off the books. Elias needed a safe house, and more importantly, he needed an appraisal of the diamonds to fund his next move. The bonds were too hot to touch yet, but raw diamonds were universal currency. By dawn, Elias was sitting in a diner near the port, the car hidden under a tarp in a long-term parking lot. He sipped black coffee, his hand resting on the pocket containing the brass key. He pulled out the journal again, reading the final pages more carefully. Henri had written a warning. The wolf has a son. He is worse. He does not want the money for greed. He wants it for power. The assets in Vault 4 include the Black Ledger, the blackmail files of the Brotherhood. This changed everything. It wasn't just gold in that vault, it was information. Information that could likely destroy political careers or expose criminal lineages that had survived into the modern era. That was why they were still hunting after 80 years. The money was irrelevant, the secrets were the weapon. Elias watched the sun rise over the cranes of the port. He wasn't just a mechanic with a lucky find anymore. He was the sole gatekeeper to a century of secrets. He decided then that he wouldn't run forever. He would use the resources he had found to turn the tables. He would fix this broken situation the only way he knew how, by taking it apart piece by piece. He finished his coffee, left a cash tip, and walked toward the payphone in the back, dialing Silas's number. The game had begun, and Elias held the only winning piece. The meeting with Silas took place in the rusted belly of a decommissioned dockside crane, a metal giant that loomed over the Savannah shipping yards like a prehistoric skeleton. Elias climbed the metal gangway, the wind whipping off the Atlantic, carrying the scent of salt and diesel. Silas was waiting in the operator's cabin, a man who looked as weathered as the machinery he lived among. He didn't ask questions about why Elias was on the run. In their line of work, silence was the most valuable currency. Elias placed 3 of the uncut diamonds on the small, grease-stained table between them. He kept the rest of the stones, the bonds, and the brass key hidden in the lining of his heavy jacket. Silas examined the stones with a jeweler's loupe, his eyebrows raising in a silent whistle of appreciation. These were old-world cuts, raw and unpolished, lacking laser inscriptions or modern tracking markers. They were ghosts of a geology that had been mined before digital records existed. The transaction was purely business. Silas agreed to fence the stones through a network of cutters in Antwerp who didn't ask for provenance. In exchange, he provided Elias with a substantial brick of cash, essential liquidity for a man whose bank accounts were likely already being monitored by the Wolf's network. But Elias needed more than cash. He needed a new skin. Silas pulled a dusty file from a safe welded to the floor, producing a clean passport and identification package. It was a high-quality forgery, the kind used by intelligence contractors. Elias was now Arthur Vance, a maritime structural engineer. The new identity was the first layer of armor Elias would need for the war he was stepping into. While Silas arranged the logistics for the next leg of the journey, Elias retreated to a safe house, a nondescript container converted into a living space deep within the labyrinth of the yard. He turned on the small television in the corner, tuning into the local news. The screen flickered, and Elias's blood ran cold. The headline, "Suspicious Fire Destroys Historic Workshop," flashed across the bottom. Aerial footage showed the smoldering remains of his barn. The roof had collapsed, and the walls were blackened skeletons. The fire hadn't been an accident. The intensity of the burn pattern suggested accelerants were used at multiple points. They hadn't just come for the engine, they had come to erase Elias from the earth. The realization solidified his resolve. There was no going back to his old life. The mechanic was dead, only the ghost remained. Elias sat at the small table in the container and laid out the brass key mechanism and the stack of bearer bonds. He needed to understand the connection before he moved. He studied the brass device under the harsh fluorescent light. It was a masterpiece of mechanical encryption, a chaotic tumbler system with four concentric rings that could be rotated. It looked like the internal workings of a cryptex. He noticed faint, etched markings on the rim of the brass rings, tiny numbers, almost invisible to the naked eye. He grabbed the stack of bearer bonds. The bonds were numbered sequentially, but he noticed that every fifth bond had a slightly different watermark, a tiny variation in the printing of the border. He used a magnifying glass to inspect the watermarks. They weren't errors, they were coordinates. By aligning the numerical values of the specific bonds with the rotation of the brass rings, the mechanism clicked. It wasn't just a key, it was a two-part authenticator. The key without the code from the bonds was useless, and the bonds without the key were just paper. Henri, the creator of the Iron Tomb, had ensured that no single thief could access the vault. The Wolf's son might have known about the engine, but without the bonds, he could never open the door. Elias held the physical master key to the Paris vault, and he had just cracked the combination. Silas returned with the final piece of the puzzle, travel arrangements. Flying commercial was impossible. Facial recognition scanners at airports would flag Elias immediately, regardless of his fake passport. The Wolf's reach likely extended into digital surveillance systems. Instead, Silas had secured him a berth on a Liberian-flagged cargo freighter, the MV Titania, departing that evening for Le Havre, France. It was a gray ship, one that often carried off-manifest cargo and didn't scrutinize its passengers. It was slow, taking 10 days to cross the Atlantic, but it was invisible. As dusk settled over the port, turning the sky a bruised purple, Elias made his way to the dock. He carried only a duffel bag containing the cash, the laptop, and the precious artifacts wrapped in oilcloth. He moved through the shadows of the stacked containers, avoiding the floodlights. Just as he reached the gangway of the Titania, he felt a prickling on the back of his neck, the instinct of a man who was being hunted. He paused behind a forklift and scanned the perimeter. 200 yards away, on the roof of a warehouse, a glint of glass reflected the dying sun. A scope. Elias didn't panic. He knew the layout of the yard better than any sniper. He dropped low, moving beneath the chassis of a straddle carrier, using the massive machinery as a moving shield. He heard the thwip of a suppressed round hitting the metal inches from where his head had been a second before. They had found him. The Wolf's son had resources that Elias had underestimated, likely satellite tracking on the burner phone he had foolishly kept on for the news. He smashed the phone against the pavement and sprinted for the ship. The freighter's engines were already churning, the gangway beginning to lift. He leaped, catching the metal railing and hauling himself up as the ship pulled away from the pier. He scrambled onto the deck, rolling behind a bulkhead, just as another shot sparked off the hull. The ship drifted into the dark channel, the gap between Elias and the shooter widening. He lay on the cold steel deck, breathing hard, watching the lights of America fade into the distance. He had escaped, but the margin of error was gone. The enemy knew he was heading to Europe. The race to the vault was no longer a secret expedition, it was a head-to-head sprint. Elias looked at his hands, covered in grease and dirt. He was done running. He had 10 days at sea to study the blueprints, memorize the combination, and prepare for what awaited him in Paris. He wasn't just bringing a key, he was bringing a reckoning. The mechanic was going to dismantle their empire, starting with the foundation buried beneath the streets of France. The 10 days aboard the MV Titania were a fugue state of diesel fumes and relentless, rhythmic vibration. To the crew, Elias was Arthur Vance, a quiet engineer who kept to his cabin and paid well for his privacy. But in the solitude of his steel quarters, Elias was stripping away the last remnants of his old life. He spent the days memorizing the blueprints of the Banque de l'Indochine, burning the complex layout of the subterranean levels into his mind until he could navigate the dark corridors with his eyes closed. The ship's machine shop became his sanctuary. Under the guise of helping the ship's grease-stained chief engineer with a stubborn generator repair, Elias gained access to tools and scrap metal. He wasn't just fixing the generator, he was building a practice rig. Using spare pipe fittings and a discarded pressure gauge, he constructed a crude physical model of the vault's locking mechanism based on Henry's journal diagrams. He practiced the sequence hour after hour: rotate left to index 4, engage the clutch, rotate right to index 7, wait for the pneumatic hiss. His fingers, calloused and scarred, learned the dance of the lock until it was muscle memory. He knew that in the depths of Paris, under extreme stress and likely in the dark, he wouldn't have time to think. His hands had to know the way. As the Titania approached the gray, choppy waters of the English Channel, the reality of his arrival loomed. Le Havre wasn't just a port, it was a choke point. The Wolf's son, a man Elias now knew from the journal as Julian, would have the docks watched. A direct disembarkation through customs was a suicide run. Elias observed the ship's routine. He noticed that before docking, the Titania slowed to pick up a local harbor pilot from a small, agile cutter. This was the gap in the fence. On the final night, amidst a driving rainstorm that lashed the deck, Elias slipped out of his cabin. He carried his duffel bag, waterproofed with trash bags and duct tape. He made his way to the aft cargo deck, near the waterline, where the pilot ladder was stowed. He didn't wait for the ship to dock. As the vessel slowed to wait for the pilot boat, Elias lowered a service rope into the black, churning water on the blind side of the hull. He rappelled down, the freezing spray stinging his face, and dropped onto the maintenance skiff tethered to the stern, a small craft used for checking the rudder. He cut the line. Drifting away into the darkness, buffeted by the wake of the massive freighter, he started the skiff's small outboard motor only when the Titania was a looming shadow in the distance. He motored into a small, unguarded fishing inlet miles north of the main commercial port, stepping onto French soil wet, cold, and completely unrecorded. Getting to Paris required the same invisibility. Public transport was a surveillance grid. Elias bought a battered 20-year-old panel van from a rural farm mechanic for cash, a vehicle so nondescript it was virtually invisible. He drove the back roads, avoiding the toll highways and their cameras, navigating through the sleepy stone villages of Normandy. He reached the outskirts of Paris under the cover of a pre-dawn smog. He didn't head for a hotel. He headed for the industrial sprawl of St. Denis, the gritty northern banlieue where workshops and warehouses formed a maze of concrete and graffiti. He rented a small, windowless garage in a sub-basement complex, paying 3 months in advance with the cash Silas had provided. This would be his forward operating base. Inside the damp garage, Elias unpacked the Iron Tomb artifacts. He taped the blueprints to the peeling wall. The target building, now the government archives, sat in the 4th arrondissement, a fortress of limestone and bureaucracy. The blueprints showed that level -3, the buried vault, sat directly above a branch of the Paris sewer system and an abandoned 19th-century pneumatic mail tunnel. This was the weakness Henri had identified 80 years ago. The vault door was impenetrable from the bank's side, guarded by modern security and the concrete seal. But the floor of the vault rested on a foundation that could be accessed from below, through the tunnels. However, the journal warned of the dead man's switch, a seismic sensor embedded in the vault's floor. Any attempt to drill or blast through the concrete from underneath would trigger the collapse of the ceiling, burying the contents, and the intruder, under tons of rubble. This was why the key was essential. Elias realized he couldn't just break in. He had to surgically bypass the system. The plan was audacious. He would enter the tunnels, locate the underside of the vault, and carefully bore a small, 1-inch hole through 3 feet of reinforced concrete to access the locking mechanism's maintenance port, a flaw in the design that Henri had exploited. He would then insert a custom-made tool, an extension of the brass key, to unlock the door from the inside out, bypassing the seismic sensors which were calibrated to detect external breaches, not internal mechanism shifts. It was a mechanical heist that required the precision of a watchmaker and the brute force of a miner. For 3 days, Elias prepped. He sourced a diamond core drill, silent and efficient, and modified it with a water cooling system to prevent dust and heat signatures. He fabricated the extension rod for the brass key, using high-tensile steel rod he bought from a local supplier. He slept in the van, ate canned food, and lived in the blueprints. On the 4th night, he was ready. He drove the van to a service access point near the Seine, a forgotten storm drain entrance, shielded by overgrown bushes. He donned a heavy maintenance worker's jumpsuit and a hard hat, transforming himself into just another invisible laborer of the city's underbelly. He lowered his gear, the drill, the key, the batteries, into the dank, echoing darkness of the tunnel. The journey underground was a nightmare of claustrophobia and stench. The old tunnels were slick with slime and infested with rats that scurried away from his headlamp. He navigated by compass and the step count he had calculated from the maps. After 2 hours of trudging through knee-deep sludge, he reached the coordinate. Above him was the brick archway of the 19th century foundation. He checked his laser rangefinder. Directly 3 meters above this brickwork was the floor of Vault 4. He set up his drilling rig, anchoring it into the ancient stone. The sound of the drill was a low hum, swallowed by the vastness of the tunnels. He worked slowly, millimeters at a time, constantly checking the resistance. If he hit a rebar and vibrated the floor too hard, the sensor would trip, and the mission would end in a crush of concrete. It took 6 hours of nerve-shredding work to breach the outer casing. The drill bit punched through into a void, the maintenance cavity. Elias stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs. He inserted a fiber-optic camera into the hole. On the small screen, he saw it, the underside of the massive gear mechanism, preserved in the dry, stale air of the sealed vault. It was exactly as Henri had drawn it. He assembled the extension rod, attaching the brass chaotic tumbler to the end. He fed it up through the hole, guiding it into the receiver slot of the lock. He felt the click as the brass teeth engaged. This was it. He pulled out the list of bond codes. Left to 4. Right to 7. He began to turn the rod. The mechanism groaned, the sound of metal waking up after 80 years of sleep. He worked the combination, sweat stinging his eyes. 1 tumbler. 2 tumblers. 3. On the final rotation, a heavy metallic clunk echoed through the concrete above him. The primary locking bolts had retracted. The door wasn't open, but it was unlocked. The seismic sensors were now bypassed because the system registered a valid entry. Elias packed his gear quickly. He had to surface and enter the building from the top now, posing as a maintenance inspector to physically push the door open. But as he turned to dismantle the drill rig, a beam of light cut through the darkness of the tunnel, blinding him. He froze. The light didn't come from a flashlight. It came from a mounted floodlight set up down the tunnel. A voice echoed, calm and amplified. "Excellent work, Mr. Vance. You possess a touch we have lacked for 3 generations." Elias squinted into the glare. Silhouette figures emerged from the shadows, flanking the light. They were heavily armed, wearing tactical gear. In the center stood a man in a pristine wool coat, holding a cane he didn't need. It was the face from the files Elias had researched, Julian, the wolf's son. He hadn't been hunting Elias to stop him. He had been hurting him. They couldn't open the vault without the key, and they couldn't use the key without the mechanic's skill to bypass the sensor. Elias realized with a sinking horror that he hadn't broken into the bank. He had just unlocked the door for the monsters.